What most people hear when they hear the number 600,000 is a casualty statistic, a battlefield number, a brutal but familiar measure of how much blood Russia has spent trying to grind its way through Ukraine. But that is not the darkest part of the story. The darkest part is what is happening to those men before they die, before they are wounded, and in many cases before they even reach the enemy. Because inside Russia's war machine, something has taken shape that should not exist inside any modern military claiming to be a great power. A system where soldiers are lied to, robbed, tortured, humiliated, and in some cases killed not by the opposing army but by their own commanders. A system where prison can look safer than service. A system where surrendering to Ukraine can look more rational than staying with Russia. And once you understand how that system works, the number 600,000 stops looking like ordinary wartime attrition. It starts looking like self-destruction. Graphics. Stay with me, because this story has 3 layers. The first layer is about how Russia is getting these men into uniform in the first place. The second is about what happens to them once they are trapped inside the system. And the third is about why this is far more dangerous for the Kremlin than the headline casualty number itself. Because armies can survive losses. What they do not survive indefinitely is the collapse of trust between soldiers and the institution sending them to war. To see that clearly, start with one man. His name is Mikhail Rodionov. He did not sign up because he was burning with patriotic conviction. He signed a military contract because it was presented to him as a way to avoid prison. He says he was promised rear area work, digging trenches and doing manual labor far from direct combat. That promise turned out to be a lie. After months of increasingly dangerous work pulling out wounded and dead from forward areas, he was abruptly told he would now take part in an assault mission. Not support work, not logistics, an assault. United 24. Media. And the mission itself tells you almost everything about the level of contempt inside this system. Rodionov says he and another soldier were quickly shown how to use electric scooters and a civilian navigation app, then given a picture of a ruined building near Petropavlivka in the Kharkiv region and ordered to reach it and hold it. The target was about 7 kilometers away. Rodionov already knew the ground. He had previously recovered bodies from that same sector. He knew assault troops there had failed to advance even a fraction of that distance before being killed. So he and his partner came to the only logical conclusion available to 2 men being handed a suicide order disguised as a mission. They ran. United 24 Media. They were caught by Chechen fighters before reaching the border. Then the real machinery revealed itself. Rodionov says he was beaten, handed to military police, moved through basements and headquarters, and asked a simple question. Would he go on the assault? When he said he was afraid and that his health was poor, he was taken for what was called a preventive conversation. According to his account, that meant being bound, having wires shoved into his mouth, and being tortured with electric shocks for 2 hours until he agreed. Think about that. A soldier is not persuaded, trained, or led. He is electrically tortured into obedience. That is not discipline. That is institutional desperation. United 24 Media. But it gets worse. At a checkpoint, other Russian soldiers realized Rodionov had likely accumulated pay on his bank card after long service with few opportunities to spend it. So they tried to extort him. First, they wanted him to buy them a motorcycle, then an ATV. When he refused to give them his PIN, he says he was taken back and tortured again with electric shocks for another 2 hours, and at one point had his cheek pierced with scissors before finally giving up the code. Just pause there for a second. This man had not even reached the assault. He had already been lied to by recruiters, tortured by handlers, and robbed by his own side. United 24 Media. Then came another attempt to force him into a frontline assault. He ran again. He was caught again. He says he was tortured again. On the 3rd round, after being bound and beaten, he was thrown outside on the ground while a commander came out to smoke and flick cigarette butts at him, warning him not to move. A colonel, according to Rodionov, walked over, stepped over his body, spoke briefly with the torturer, and walked away. No intervention, no outrage, no pretense that this was abnormal. That detail may be the most revealing of all because it suggests not rogue brutality, but tolerated brutality, not breakdown, but culture. United 24 Media. Eventually, Rodionov was put through a farcical 2-day assault training course and sent toward another attack. This time he asked to go to the toilet just before the assault began, then ran toward Ukrainian positions and surrendered. In his telling, Ukrainian captivity was safer than returning to his own side, which had already promised to shoot him if he tried to flee again. His warning to other Russian men was devastatingly clear. Do not believe the army. 10 years in prison is better than military service. They throw people into the meat grinder, and war is death. United 24 Media. Now, if Rodionov's story were an isolated horror, it would be shocking but limited. But that is not what the evidence suggests. The interviewed Russian soldiers who described fellow troops being executed for refusing orders or trying to retreat. 2 men said they saw soldiers shot on commanders' orders. Others described torture with electric shocks, starvation, humiliation, and beatings. One man said he was tied to a tree, hit, had a gun put to his head, and was urinated on while his commander announced to others, "We've got a new toilet." Another said men who refused orders were electrocuted, starved, and then sent into meat storm assaults, sometimes effectively unarmed. One former medic described 20 men being brought in, their bank cards taken, and then being killed, with paperwork simply fabricated afterward. News that matters for one reason above all. It shows that Rodionov is not describing an exception. He is describing a pattern. And that pattern explains why the 600,000 figure is so misleading if you look at it only as combat losses. Because a large military can absorb battlefield casualties if the institution behind it remains coherent. If soldiers trust their officers. If pay actually arrives. If punishment is tied to law, if men believe they have a reasonable chance of survival when they follow orders. But when soldiers begin to believe that their own commanders are as dangerous as the enemy, the army is no longer just bleeding outward, it is rotting inward. Now zoom out even further and look at how this machine is being fed. Russia has tried very hard to avoid another politically explosive nationwide mobilization. U.S. officials said Russian casualties surpassed 600,000 by late 2024, and subsequent estimates have gone much higher. And other reporting show Moscow responded not with a politically cleaner war, but with more money, more pressure, and a wider dragnet. Moscow raised signing incentives so that a contract soldier from the capital could make about 5.2 million rubles in a first year of service, more than 5 times the average wage. Putin also ordered the army expanded again, taking active servicemen toward 1.5 million. That tells you something crucial. This war is consuming manpower at a rate that requires constant replenishment. And who fills that manpower gap? Increasingly, the people with the fewest options. The casualty work found that the burden of death falls heavily on poorer regions, occupied Donbass communities, and convicts recruited from prisons. Reported that Russia's parliament backed rules allowing the defense ministry to sign contracts with suspected or convicted criminals, effectively widening the funnel of desperation into the military. Analysis of confirmed deaths found more than 95,000 identified dead by early 2025, with the likely real total far higher, and noted that convicts may account for as much as a third of Russia's military fatalities over 3 years. This is not a force built around a stable, healthy recruitment base. It is a manpower extraction system targeting those least able to refuse. News, and even that was apparently not enough. Also reported Ukrainian claims that more than 1,700 Africans from 36 countries were fighting for Russia, with officials in Ghana describing men being lured through deceptive job offers, despite having no military background. Whether every number is exact or not, the pattern is unmistakable. When voluntary enthusiasm is insufficient, the system reaches for poverty, criminal vulnerability, foreign deception, and administrative pressure. It does not behave like a state overflowing with confident patriotic manpower. It behaves like a state improvising replacements for a war it cannot afford to stop and cannot easily sell honestly. Now add the corruption layer, because this is where the story becomes even darker. Russia sells military service with money, big money, at least by the standards of many poorer regions. But reporting found soldiers and veterans being scammed, robbed, and stripped of those payments by police, recruitment center staff, local officials, taxi networks, and even commanders inside units. In one case, a serviceman told that his unit had to hand over bank cards and pins to a sergeant major who allegedly ended up holding around 50 salary cards, many belonging to missing soldiers. In another case, police accused of robbing a wounded veteran avoided prosecution by themselves, signing up to go to war. Think about the moral geometry of that system. Men are recruited with promises of life-changing money. Then their money becomes another resource to be harvested by the same ecosystem that sent them into danger. News. So now put the pieces together. A man can be recruited because prison is worse, or because poverty is worse, or because a false job promise looks better than unemployment. He can be told he will serve in a safe role. He can arrive and find himself pushed closer and closer to the front. He can be threatened into an assault mission he knows is suicidal. If he resists, he can be beaten, shocked, humiliated, or robbed. If he runs, he may be tortured. If he survives, his pay can be stolen. If he dies, the paperwork can be manipulated. And if he finally concludes that the safest route available is surrendering to Ukraine, that is not an individual moral collapse. That is a systemic verdict on the institution he served. This is why the title matters. Something dark is happening to 600,000 Russian soldiers. The darkness is not just that they are dying in staggering numbers. The darkness is that the war has created a military environment in which the Russian state appears to be consuming its own manpower with almost colonial indifference, using it, burning it, recycling it, stealing from it, terrorizing it, then demanding more. And strategically, this should terrify the Kremlin, because battlefield losses can sometimes be replaced with more recruits and more money. But once the frontline testimony reaches back into the recruitment pool, the damage compounds. Every account like Rodionov's tells potential recruits that the contract may be a lie. Every story of electric shocks, stolen salary cards, and meat storm assaults undermines the financial incentives being used to avoid another mobilization. Every soldier who decides that captivity is safer than service delivers the same message to everyone listening at home. This is not a military career, it is a trap. Casualty graphics make the broader military logic brutally clear. Russia has occupied only limited additional territory after the early phases of the invasion, while losses have continued to mount at extreme levels. Analysts cited there describe monthly casualties on a massive scale and an attritional model in which tiny tactical gains cost enormous numbers of lives. That kind of war is hard enough to sustain with a professional force that trusts itself. Sustaining it with a force that fears its own command structure is something else entirely. Graphics. And that brings us to the deepest layer of the story. The Russian army's problem is no longer just Ukraine's drones, artillery, and defenses. Its problem is that the institution appears to be teaching its own soldiers a catastrophic lesson, that they are expendable twice over. Expendable to the enemy and expendable to the system that sent them there. Once that lesson spreads widely enough, pay becomes less persuasive. Threats become less effective. Even prison may start to look rational by comparison. And the moment that calculation becomes common, the war machine does not just weaken at the front, it weakens at the source. That is why this should not exist. A military can be brutal. A military can be corrupt. A military can even survive periods of terrible leadership. But a military that recruits through desperation, disciplines through torture, steals from its own men, and sends them into near-suicidal assaults while pretending this is normal, is running on borrowed time. It may still advance in places, it may still inflict terrible damage, it may still absorb unbelievable losses, but beneath the appearance of mass, something much more fragile is taking shape. An army that is fighting Ukraine, and an army that is fighting itself. That second war is the one the Kremlin cannot openly admit, but it may be the more important of the two. Because when a soldier looks at prison, at torture, at corruption, at surrender, and concludes that the safest option is to run toward the enemy, the state has already lost something larger than a body on a battlefield. It has lost legitimacy in the eyes of the very people it needs to keep the war going. And that is the real meaning of this story. Not just that Russia has lost or chewed through hundreds of thousands of men. Not just that the casualty count is horrifying, but that inside that number is a deeper truth. The system appears to be destroying the men it depends on, morally, physically, and institutionally, faster than any propaganda machine can cover up forever. That is dark, that is real, and that is why 600,000 is not just a number.